6, verse 1 and on, the Bible says as follows. After these things, Jesus went over to the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of the Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him because they saw his signs, which he performed on those who were deceased. And Jesus went up to the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many?" Then Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost." Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had already eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." Word of God. You may be seated. Thanksgiving and abundance. As we see throughout the Bible, everywhere Jesus went, crowds were always pressing him, demanding his attention. Today's passage tells us a story, very familiar story, that we all have heard preachings about, the feeding of the 5,000, not including the women and the children. But the passage that we just read in John, it tells us this story, or something that sometimes we miss in the story, is that after Jesus is teaching and healing the people, the Bible tells us that Jesus leaves the crowds behind, and he takes time for himself and for his disciples. The book of Mark, who also tells us about this story, tells the story in chapter 6 of Mark, and it tells us that Jesus had compassion on the crowds, and that's the reason that he would teach them every single day. But as the day ended, the Bible tells us that Jesus seemed to make an impossible decision, and that was to feed all the people that had been hearing him since the morning. Jesus and his disciples, according to what we read in John, they are taking over something very difficult. To some people, it was observed that Jesus was even thinking of feeding these crowds. And as we read the response from Jesus, we are going to draw 2 principles that I believe that we all face in our lives, and principles that I believe that Jesus was trying to teach his disciples. And that is the principle of thanksgiving and abundance. As we read the story, the Bible tells us that Jesus is telling or testing one of his disciples. And the Bible says that he tells his disciples, as he lifts his eyes and sees the great multitude that's coming towards him, Jesus tells the disciples, "Where shall we buy bread? Where are we going to buy bread so that we could feed all these people?" And John tells us that this is a question that Jesus is asking to test his disciples. In other words, it's not that Jesus did not know what he was going to do. As a matter of fact, John tells us that Jesus already knew the outcome. In other words, he already knew that he was going to multiply bread. He already knew that he was going to feed 5,000 plus people. because God knows everything and nothing is a surprise for him. In other words, everything that happens in life, God is on top of it. God's in charge of it. And there's nothing that takes God by surprise. There is nothing that God doesn't know. And John tells us this. John tells us Jesus already knew what he was going to do. But he pops this question to the disciples because he's trying to test them. He's trying to prove something. He's trying to find out what the disciples are made of. And this is kind of ironic because for Jesus to test someone teaches us that there are things that are going to happen, or there's going to be positions and situations where us as Christians, our faith is going to be tested. This is what we find out, or what we gather from what Jesus was trying to do to his disciples. He challenged them with this question. Where are we going to buy bread? We need bread to feed all these people. You tell me, where are we going to buy so much bread to feed all these people? And John specifically tells us that it was a trick question that Jesus was trying to test his disciples. And this teaches us very important points in our Christian walk. And the first one is that as Christians, we're all going to be put in situations and positions where our faith is going to be tested. Peter tells us that even though right now we rejoice, but momentarily, sometimes it's going to be necessary for us to be afflicted in diverse trials in life so that our faith could be put on test. But the Bible tells us that our faith being greater and better than the gold, even though it is going to be passed through the fire, the Bible says that it is so that it could come out as something dignified of worship and glory to the honor and glory of God. And as we read throughout the Bible, there are many men of God that were tested. The Bible tells us that Job was tested. And as Satan comes and tells Jesus, well, of course he's going to worship you. Of course he's going to come to church every day. And he's going to tithe. And he's going to be an excellent member. You have given him everything. There's nothing that he lacks. You have surrounded him by blessings. There is nothing that he needs. So it is obvious that someone in that position, of course, he's going to give you a little bit more than others that don't have what he has. So the Bible tells us that God allows Satan to test it. And God tells him, okay, I'm going to permit for you to take away everything. Everything that he has. Everything that makes you think that he loves me and he serves me. And that's the reason he does it. Take it away. And the Bible tells us that his faith was tested through those trials and tribulations and losing his family. And we see the outcome of the life of Job, that the Bible tells us that he was faithful and he was loyal and he was able to tell God and the devil and his friends, well, God gave, God took away. Let the name of God be glorified today and forever. But his faith was tested. We have Abraham, who the Bible tells us that God makes a request for him to kill in sacrifice and give in sacrifice his only son. And the Bible tells us that God was testing him. And when Abraham was about to cut his throat, sacrifice him, the Bible says that God comes out in a voice and tells him, Abraham, Abraham, don't do nothing to the child, because now I know that you love me. Because you have not refused to give me your only son. So this teaches us that in life, our faith is going to be tested. Why? Only we and God know why our faith is at times tested. It's hard for us to comprehend why Job was tested and Abraham was tested. But the Bible shows us that God will put us in situations and positions to test our faith. And in this instinct, we see that the disciples are being tested. And the Bible shows us that God is trying to find out what they're made of. Secondly, this story tells us that
don't identify with Jesus, but we're more like Philip. A lot of people tell us, well, we have to be more like Jesus. But in the story that we just read, we identify ourselves more with Philip. Because the Bible says that Jesus knew the miracle that was coming because he is God. But in this sense of the story, we're more like Philip, which we're faced with crowds and we are asked with impossible tasks to do. And here's the story, and here's where we're going to go into our teaching. But the Bible tells us that as God is testing the disciples, when he asked this question, where are we going to buy so much bread? One of the disciples comes with an answer. And the Bible says that he says, well, there are so many. You know, there's so many people here, Lord. Where are we going to get bread to feed all these people? The Bible says that someone there found a little boy who had a couple of loaves of bread and had a couple of fish, and they brought them to Jesus and to the disciples as a response to what he was asking. And as soon as the disciples saw those loaves of bread and those fish, Andrew looks at them, and with despair, he says, what are these among so many? In other words, what he's saying, this is insignificant. What you are looking at, or what the answer that you have brought to the table, this is nothing. There is nothing that we could do with 2 pieces of loaves and 2 fish to feed all these multitudes. And this is the principle of Thanksgiving that I want to talk about today. That, first of all, as Christians, we need to be thankful for what we have. And, you know, thank God that we have plenty. You know, I thank God that even though too many of us, it doesn't seem in abundancy, but what God has given us today has been sufficient to sustain us up to this day. And there's a principle that we need to learn as we go into this month of Thanksgiving and as we go through life, is that we need to be first thankful for what we have. Jesus, the Bible tells us that he gave thanks for those loaves and the 2 fish. And the miracle has not happened, but the Bible tells us, and Jesus is teaching us, that he offered thanksgiving for the blessing that was at hand. While people and the disciples were saying, what is this? This is junk. This is ridiculous. There's nothing that we could do with 2 loaves and 2 fish. Because on the eyes of the disciples and of Philip, this was nothing. This was insignificant. This was not the answer to their problems. But in the eyes of God and in the hands of God, the Bible tells us that God heard the response from the disciples, but he put that away, and the Bible says that he took the bread. He started breaking the bread, and then he gave thanks for the loaf and the fish that he had. And the miracle had not happened, but Jesus is giving thanksgiving for the blessing that is at hand. Why? Because the Bible tells us that Jesus knows what's about to come. But his disciples and the crowd that was watching did not know that. And as they saw Jesus, as they saw him praying and thanking God for those 2 pieces of bread, in their minds, their faith, they were thinking, this is ridiculous. This is not going to feed not even us. But the Bible says that God was giving, or Jesus was giving thanks, even though the miracle had not happened. He was blessing God for what he had at hand. And this is an important point that I want to make. Because we live in a culture of discontent. Nothing is never sufficient for us. Nothing is ever satisfying to our human appetite. If God gives us a raise that we've been praying for, or we've been not even praying, we have just been annoying God and just been criticizing God that this is not enough, and look at me, and because we don't thank him, what we do is we go and complain and say, God, you know my situation and I'm frustrated and I'm angry because I can't provide for my needs. We don't give thanks, because giving thanks is saying, God, thank you for what I have. Thank you for what you provide. Thank you, Lord, because I might not have what I want, but I have what I need, because every single day you provide for my needs, because this is what God does. God provides our daily bread. God provides our shelter. God provides our food. And the Bible says that we need to be content with these things. But we live in a discontent culture. And Jesus is teaching this to his disciples, that we need to be thankful for what we have. And this is something that it's going to help us to worship God and to be at peace in our hearts with God and with the people and our surroundings. Because we need to be thankful that we have a roof over our heads. That is something glorious that sometimes we don't even appreciate.
Amen.
You know, thank God that we have a home. Maybe it's not mine and it's never going to be mine, and maybe in 15 years I'm going to be able to pay off that mortgage, but that's not even important. I'm not even thinking of owning that, because as long as God puts a roof over our head,
Amen.
the Bible says that we should be thankful because He is providing for our daily needs. And that is something glorious. Be thankful for the roof over your heads. Be thankful for the people that surround you, even though they're not perfect and they're full of flaws, just like me and you are. But we need to be thankful for every little thing that God gives us. And the little things that God gives are the things that we often neglect in our lives. We don't know how to give thanks for the daily bread that God puts on our table, just that daily plate that God puts us. Just recently, I was at a home visiting someone, and the wife was complaining because the children were using dishes and they were just putting them on the right there where they wash the dishes, and she was upset, and you could see her frustration, and she was arguing that they should use not that many plates and stop using so much plates. And when I went and dropped my plate, because I felt guilty that I didn't want to make her more upset, so I got my plate and I took it so I could go wash it. There was a sign on the front that said, "Be thankful for dirty dishes." And it was ironic because he has this sign there, "Be thankful for dirty dishes." And in my mind, I was thinking, well, the more dirty dishes you have in your sink, then it's a sign that you have abundance of food. And to me, that sign simplified that. Thank God that there's dirty dishes to dirty, because God gives us food, God gives us provision, God gives us more than what we need. And that should be a sign that God is great. But yet, that was getting this person upset and angry because she felt that it was creating extra work. Well, we need to be thankful for those little things that sometimes we seem to take for granted. Because this is what Jesus was trying to teach his disciples. Be thankful for what you have on hand. Yes, 2 loaves of bread and 2 fishes, in your eyes, it's nothing. It's insignificant. Just like at times we feel, Lord, this job is not good enough. This car is not good enough. This house is not good enough. Well, let me tell you something. Thank God for what we have on hand. Thank God for the blessing that He gives us today. Thank God that I'm better off today than I was 20 years ago. And we need to be thankful for what we have on hand. You know, it takes work and sacrifice, and it takes time for us to develop ourselves in this world. But as we journey into life, we need to be thankful for what we have on hand. And not complain so much and put so much pressure on our families to be better providers and to give us more than what we have. We need to say, God, thank you, Lord, because yes, he might have a job that doesn't pay good, but thank God that at least he has a job. Thank God that at least he's able to pay the rent. Thank God that at least we could go to McDonald's once in a while and we could have a meal. Thank God, Lord, for those blessings that you have on hand. And Jesus was trying to teach the disciples And we notice that Jesus is being thankful. He pronounced thanks for God's provision. And the Bible says that after he broke the bread, he told the disciples, pass it along. And here comes the second point that I'm going to make before I finish. The Bible tells us that Jesus gave thanks for what he had on hand. He tells his disciples, go and give it to everyone, sit them down. And it tells us that there was 5,000 men. And the Bible says that the disciples passed the bread, passed the fish. And it gives us, the Bible tells us that not only did they eat, but the Bible says that they ate as much as they pleased. In other words, it wasn't as Philip had said, what is this? This is not even enough for someone to eat. No. The Bible tells us that they gave, he broke, he gave thanksgiving, and he gave to the people. And the Bible says that they had so much. In other words, they had until they were full. They had as much as plenty as they wanted. As a matter of fact, the Bible says that there was so much food and there was so much bread and fish that Jesus says, you know what? Make sure that you get baskets and nothing of the leftovers gets lost, but go and pick them up. And the Bible tells us that the disciples went and they picked up 12 baskets full of bread and fish that the Bible says had been left over after Jesus gave thanks for what was at hand. And this is the second point that I want to make. That there's a principle of abundance at play in this text. First is that we serve a God of abundance. And sometimes abundance comes in unexpected ways. None of the gospel writers gives us any idea how the miracle happened. In other words, I don't read in the Bible that after Jesus prayed for the food and he broke the fish and he broke the bread, the Bible doesn't tell us that out of a sudden dozens of fish came out or that bread just multiplied in front of their eyes. Nothing like that happened. It's not like that story that people say, well, as soon as he broke and he prayed, out of a sudden those 2 fishes turned into 200 fishes. Or those 2 pieces of loaves, out of a sudden, magically, another 2,000 pieces of bread appeared. No. The Bible doesn't tell us anything like that. The Bible tells us that they went and they began to give out from the basket what Jesus had prayed of those 2 loaves and those 2 fishes. And out of that, magically and miraculously, everyone ate. The baskets were passed around everyone, and everyone stretched out their hand, and everyone took a piece, and when they wanted more, the baskets came back, and the fish and bread were there. But no one knows how this happened, because abundancy sometimes comes in unexpected ways. It was placed in baskets, and suddenly they were filled to the rim, because God created a miracle. And this is the second point, and I'm going to finish with this. That when we're thankful and when we're grateful to God for what we have on hand, God knows how to bless us in abundance. And this is what we need to learn. But before God is able to bless us with abundance and gives us what we sometimes complain that we need and what we want, we need to be thankful for what we have on hand. That's the first principle. Be thankful for what you have. Be thankful for the daily provision. Be thankful for that $10 an hour job. Be thankful for that car that makes noises when you drive it. Be thankful for that car that the air conditioner doesn't work. And be thankful for, what you call junk. Because this is what we do to the things that God gives us. It's insignificant. That house is too small. That car is, it's too dirty. It's always, making noises. And we even go to the point to say, I'm embarrassed. People seeing me in this car. Like if you're royalty or worth something, no. Buy the car fits who we are. But for some reason, we feel out of place. And we tend to call things junk. This is junk. This car is junk. This house is junk. And it comes to a point that even our children, they get served a food of plate. And they say, this is junk. This is disgusting. And the things that God gives us to this point, that God puts at hand for us, we tend to not appreciate. And everything's junk to us, and everything's wasted, and nothing's ever sufficient to fulfill our gratitude and just, to fulfill what God has given us. And that's the reason that sometimes we don't get an abundance, and we struggle, and God tests our faith, and He puts us through different trials and tribulation, and our faith is continually being tested. And we never get to the point where we begin to see the abundancy of God starting to flow in our lives. And there are times that many of us go years with just having what we have on hand, just the provision, and just the daily things. But during that time that we're being tested, or our faith is being tested to be grateful, we never learn to just thank God and say, Lord, this is sufficient for me. I worship you now, and I pray now, and I sacrifice my time, and I sacrifice everything that you give me, because everything that you give me is yours. And I'm thankful, Lord, and I'm going to worship you as if I had more than anyone else. And it doesn't matter of what I think or people think that I have. Lord, as long as you give me the daily provision, I will worship you, and I will be content, and I will be thankful. When we come to that point where our faith is tested, and we are grateful in the little things that Philip called them, this is nothing. This is junk. This is not sufficient. What are you thinking, Jesus? That with 2 loaves and 2 fish you're going to feed people? You're being ridiculous. Well, when we are thankful, and when we get that gratitude for those insignificant things that God gives you today, and you learn the aspect of just being grateful, just thanking God, just waking up every single day, and instead of complaining, saying, thank you, Lord. At least I'm not going to ride the bus. At least no one's going to pick me up and give me a ride. At least, Lord, you give me this car, and at least I have a home, and at least I have this little thing. When we learn how to be grateful and come and raise our hands and just give thanks to God, abundancy is going to come to your life. And people say, well, how? How does abundancy come? Abundancy comes in unexpected ways. Because, there's some of us that maybe we don't have education. We don't have very smarts. But we have the grace of God. And God puts us in positions that sometimes they're unexpected. And sometimes we sit and group among people that have education and have spent thousands of dollars trying to obtain the greatest education to have the best jobs. But then there's someone there sitting down who did not go through all that struggle and all that trouble, but he has the grace of God. And in unexpected ways, God puts us in positions where the abundancy of the blessings of God come to our lives. Not because we're wise, not because we're smart, not because we're better than anyone. No, because God is good, God is merciful, and God puts us in positions of abundance. And they come in unexpected ways. And they will come in unexpected ways when we learn how to be thankful for what we have on hand. All of a sudden, as you are thankful and as you are grateful for what you have, believe me, God will open doors in your life unexpectedly. And God will pour and rain blessings upon His life that you don't even know how they come, and you don't even know how you got there, and you're not even going to question it. All you're going to do is say, thank you, Lord, because I know that you are the one that provides and does all these things because you are good. And as Philip is being tested, I think especially in the days that we're living, we are tested. And it's okay, that we have good jobs, and I thank God every day for the positions that He has given me. But I get up every morning and I say, Lord, this is temporary. And I don't expect to be here very long. And I'm here, Lord, now. But if tomorrow it's gone, I'll be okay. Because I have you. And you're with me. And another door will open. And the journey will continue. But I'm never stuck into a situation where that's my life. And that's where I sit. And that's my throne. And this is what identifies me. And this is me. No. Because everything that we have in this world, it's temporary. It's provisional. God gives one day, and then the next day He closes, and then He opens, and that's the journey of life, because this world is temporary. And what God is trying to teach Philip is saying, you know what? This is not insignificant. In your eyes, what you have on hand, it's insignificant because you haven't learned how to appreciate the value of what God puts on your table. But God is telling him, Philip, when you learn how to give thanks, and when you learn how to have faith and say, you know what, God is my provider. It's not that company, it's not that president, it's not him. No, God is our provider. God is the one that gives. God is the one that knows everything in our lives. And when you learn that, you're going to learn not to call the little things that God puts in front of you insignificant, but learn how to appreciate it. Learn how to live with that journey. And when God sees your heart, and when God sees a grateful heart, and when God sees someone that is content and puts Him in first place, God will abundantly bless you with more blessings because God is good. Why don't we get it? Why don't we bless?